public sector, can be politicians, civil servants, interest groups, whatever. But we will adopt a very specific approach. And of course it is not the only approach, but let's say that we now, in the world of rational choice theory, we adopt very strict assumptions, and I will talk about that later, and we will say, in this rational choice world, how can we explain decision-making processes? So we assume that all individuals are rational. And we will see that if we assume that all individuals are rational, that it's almost impossible to explain decision-making outcomes. There are a lot of individuals participating in decision-making processes, and all of these individuals have preferences. And it's highly likely that all these individuals have different preferences. We will see that it's almost impossible to, whatever decision-making rule you adopt, to arrive at an outcome. And we will start, as I said, from at the individual level, and we'll try to see how all kinds of individuals interact with each other, forced sometimes to come to a decision, but unable to do so. And then we can analyze the conditions under which it is possible that rational individuals agree and can decide what is good for society. So we start, this is a definition that you can find in the book, of a definition of politics in the broadest sense possible. So it's not only politics with politicians, but also in companies, among interest groups, in every group that you can find in society. And this definition of Schatzler is individuals that are interacting, maneuvering, dissembling, strategizing, cooperating, and much else besides, as they pursue whatever it is they pursue in group life. So we start from the individual level, and we want to explain group decisions that impact on society. So parliamentary deliberations are, of course, an obvious example. So we can look at voting. But we can also look at local politics, the more traditional version of local politics. We can look at the EU negotiations, because you're also following a course in EU politics and policy. I will not use a lot of examples, because then you will have one block only about the EU. So I'm hoping to also use other examples from national politics, policy, and bureaucracy. But negotiations on international agreements at the supranational level with the European Parliament, a lot of academics have analyzed how the different institutions interact with each other, what the role is of individuals and their preferences, and what outcomes can be and how they can be explained. I already said social movements, interest groups, lobbying groups. We will also analyze those towards the end of this course, and we will see that if you are part of a small group, that it's much easier to organize this group than with a larger group. So most of the time we see that a very small segment of society is able to influence this society, whereas bigger groups are not able to do this. Think about unions. They have often a collective action problem. If you compare that with the organizations that organize business, they are much more able to organize themselves, and that's not only because they have money, but also because there are less of them. And it's much easier to organize these groups. And we're going to look in detail at the dynamics within the groups that foster the cohesion of these groups. And we are going to look at parliaments in Western democracies, liberal democracies, but we will also look at what it means if certain conditions are not fulfilled. Where you have a very strong agenda setup, like the Communist Party in China. or in other countries where you can even talk about dictators. I already said we're also going to look at bureaucracy. So it's not only big politics, like Soviet Union or China, but we're also going to look at what are now the motivations from a rational choice perspective of bureaucrats, of public officials. What do they want? Do they just want to increase their budget, and maybe they do not care about the services that they are providing for society, or maybe they have mixed preferences? And what does it mean if they only want to increase their budget? What does it mean for society, and can politicians control this? Now, I already said we're going to also look at more traditional forms of politics, and you can already discover a little bit that it doesn't really matter what kind of society you're looking at. Rational choice models always have something to say about the outcome of decision-making processes. Just follow the assumptions, and then you automatically arrive at prediction. So traditional, modern, it doesn't really matter. We all can analyze different situations with the same models. At least that's the ambition of rational choice theory. Now, I already mentioned a couple of times rational choice. And very often, and probably among you, this is exactly the same, rationality is seen as sometimes good or impossible to achieve. And we are not rational, we as human beings. Now, what is known commonly when we talk about rationality is probably not what we are going to talk about here. It's a very strict set of assumptions which has to do with preferences of individuals, and individuals choosing their actions to reach certain goals that are related with their preferences. Now, just keep this in mind when we are going to discuss the models and what it means to model reality. And then later in the lecture, I'm going to discuss really what we mean with rationality. So what we are going to discuss in this course, and especially in this first lecture, is what is rationality and why is cooperation between rational individuals difficult? And is there a fair and efficient decision-making rule? And how can we explain the difficulty of reaching an efficient decision on a distributive policy field? So where the win of one individual is the loss of the other. Now if we go to the objectives, the learning objectives of this course, and hopefully at the end of the course you will be able to do all those things. Well, learn new analytical tools. I'm now more or less talking in the abstract about rational choice theory, but what we are going to do, we are going to look at very specific tools that you can use to analyze decision-making processes. And the two major ones are so-called spatial models. We are going to try to see if with various individuals or groups of individuals and their preferences, you can put into a space with an x and a y-axis, and to see if you can find if there's some kind of overlap between the preferences, and to see if there's a possibility to reach a conclusion, to reach a decision in the decision-making process. And we're also going to look at game theory. Now, game theory you probably are familiar with, something like the prisoner's dilemma, which is quite famous. Two prisoners that are both arrested, but the police doesn't have sufficient information, and they cannot communicate with each other, and they can either confess or just keep their mouth shut, and they have various payoffs. So if they both keep their mouth shut, they only get 1 year of prison sentence. But if they both talk, then they go to jail for maybe a much longer time. And if one keeps quiet and the other talks, then the one that talks makes sure that the other one goes to prison. So these interactions we can model in a very simple matrix. We can assign payoffs, and we'll provide examples in a minute. Now, these analytical tools are important, but they are especially important to apply to actual decision-making processes. We are not just interested in a couple of curves, lines, and matrices where you can find payoffs. We really want to apply this to actual decision-making processes. So the last point, get the skills to apply rational choice, analytical tools to real-world decision-making processes. That's the ultimate goal of this course. Okay, let's go to some of the organizational issues of this course. There are lectures, there are no tutorial groups. There will be some discussion in class. It will not be only me talking, hopefully. This is the old version of the book. Everyone got the book, by the way. Just raise your hand if you already bought the book. So if you look at the reading, you can see that it really differs what is expected. Sometimes you have to read a lot, especially towards the end. And sometimes you don't really have to prepare a lot for the lecture, it seems. I'll already warn you a little bit. This book is considered to be rather difficult. And it's not because it's written in a difficult style. I mean, the first chapter saying politics isn't rocket science. It's a little bit a popular style of writing, typical for American scholars. But what the book is talking about is actually quite difficult. And it's something completely different from what you had so far. So not a lot of pages doesn't mean that it's easy. And you really have to study in depth to understand how you can apply those rational choice tools. And every week, next to the reading material, you have to make a very small assignment. It's half a page, 1 page. And these assignments are aimed at linking the rather abstract theory to practical, real-life decision-making processes. And in that sense, they are aimed, and this is a difference compared to last year for the third-year students present. These new assignments aim really to make a link between the difficult theory that we're discussing in class and that you studied in the book with actual decision-making processes. And in the book, a lot of examples are given from the context of the United States. What I aim to do is update these examples. You will see in the first assignment that there's an example of the fiscal cliff, the problems between the Republican Party, the Democrats, and President Obama at the beginning of this year, in January. So I will update these examples, but I also will provide new examples. And in that way, hopefully, I can inspire you when deciding on which topic you are writing your paper. Now, these assignments are not graded, so it's pass or fail. They are compulsory, and if you miss an assignment, you don't get a final grade. Now, these assignments are not meant that you write pages and pages that were all about organizational issues, and so to get a little bit of an idea what we're going to do. What we are now going to discuss is the approach that Shepson and Bonček are writing about in their book. And they say, or he is saying, in the new version, that it's a positive approach and not normative. So it is not about how something should be in an ideal world, It's actually just analyzing, observing, thinking about real-life decision-making processes. And these authors, who are all in this context of rational choice theory, they all state that it is possible to observe. If you would look at other scholars that would reject this positive way of looking at the world, they would say that everything we see are constructs, and everyone looks at a certain phenomena and understands it in a different way. These positivists, they say we observe the real world and everyone more or less understands the same thing when he looks at a decision-making process in Parliament. Now, another important point is that they, public choice scholars, or social choice, or rational choice, or all different terms for the same thing, they all want to explain something. So just description of a decision-making process is not what they are interested in. They need description to see what they want to explain, but the ultimate goal is to see how does something work. Why was it impossible to arrive at a certain decision? Why was this decision taken? All kinds of why questions are asked by these scholars. So it is not just describing the history of a decision-making process, it is really analyzing this decision-making process. So in your papers, of course, you need description to make clear what happened in a certain decision-making process, in a municipality council, or in the Council of the European Union. Of course you need description, but the description is only a means to the end, and the end is really explaining. And we are searching for regularities that we can observe in an empirical reality. We're not so much interested in all kinds of details, but we're really looking for things that can be maybe generalized to other decision-making processes. Now we do this by modeling. And what is modeling? Well, it's just basically leaving out a lot of complexity so that we are able to analyze the real-life decision-making process. So, of course, the three parties at the Katshuis negotiations, the Liberals, the Christian Democrats, and the Freedom Party, were not the only parties influencing the negotiations. There was the media, there were maybe lobby groups, there were maybe opposition parties. All these things matter. But in the model that I show you, they don't matter. We have two issues, we have preferences, we have three parties, and we have existing policy. And we just see if they can agree to change that policy. And we exclude media, we exclude other parties, we exclude lobby groups, we exclude all those actors to see if we, with this model of three actors and negotiations on two issues, we can explain whether the negotiations were a success or a failure. And this is actually a model of reality. It tries to come close to reality, but we realize, of course, that we leave out a lot of detail. Now, leaving out detail can develop into a theory, as you can see on the slide, because this is really for the specific application to a certain decision-making process. And the whole idea of modeling is, I also got a question in the break, is not that you pick a decision-making process of which you already know that it fits the theory and fits the model. That's not the idea. The idea is you have three players, you have two issues, you map them in a spatial model, you predict that it's very difficult to come to an agreement, that that's your model. And then you are going to look at the real-life decision-making process in a Katshuis, and there you will find out that indeed they failed, and you have an explanation. Just imagine that they were able to agree, the three parties, then your model would not fit reality, but then you can discuss, okay, how can I adapt my model so that it fits? So maybe you have to introduce a fourth player. And the whole idea is that if you didn't model from the start and make choices who to include players, institutional rules, you wouldn't have known what is missing. So treating a model not as a way of confirming it, but seeing to what extent it fits reality, also sheds light on what is missing, and then you have a finding. So it's actually better in a paper, more easy to write, if you have a nice, neat model that doesn't really fit reality. Because then in the conclusion you can elaborate on what you can improve in your model. So a model does not have to be true, but it has to be useful. You have to be able to use a model to show, for example, which assumptions are not correct, and if you have to add certain assumptions. Now here you can see a couple of terms that are important. Rational choice theory, a model, approach. This is just a set of assumptions, and I will introduce shortly the three core assumptions that we are working with. We talked about spatial models, game theory. Those are really the tools, the methods of analysis that we use to predict or to explain certain decision-making processes. And then we have rational choice institutionalism. And institutionalism does not refer to the European Parliament as a European institution, but with institution we mean here basically the rules of the game. So there is a rule that when the Tweede Kamer, the House of Representatives in the Netherlands, adopts a law, that the Senate, the Eerste Kamer, has to agree upon that law. That's just a rule. And that is what we call here an institution. And this is an example of a formal rule, but there are also a lot of informal rules. So an informal rule can be all kinds of negotiations that take place behind closed doors between actors that are important in a decision-making process. A so-called achterkamertjespolitiek is typically an informal rule that for a very long time everyone followed and are still following in order to reach conclusions, to reach decisions. But this is also a rule. It's not written down, but everyone follows this institution, this rule. So rational choice institutionalism is really about the rules of the game that need to be taken into account by rational individuals. Now, what is rationality? I already said it's probably not what commonly is understood by it. It's a very strict set of assumptions that we are departing from. So it's not all-knowing or brilliant, it's not good in itself. It is not that people who are completely rational, that they are selfish or evil. What it basically is that people have preferences and they have expectations. What the likelihood is that they can reach those preferences. And that's it. Now let's start with the preferences. People have wants, they want certain things. And what we are talking about is individuals. Individuals want certain things. So this can be based on biology, on values, religion, ideology, identity. It can be whatever. And we are not really interested in where preferences come from. We just assume that they are there, and we start thinking and basing our models on the preferences that are given So if we want to know what the preferences of people are, we can always ask. But that's about it. We are not interested where they are coming from. And the first assumption here, and I will discuss 3 assumptions in total. The first assumption is that preferences are relatively stable. So of course preferences of individuals change, but we're not interested in change of preferences. We assume they are stable in a certain time period, and we model on the basis of those stable preferences. If we want to see what the change of preferences of individuals did to a decision-making process, then we really have to be strict on what time frame we are studying. So that's the first assumption. Preferences are relatively stable. Now, we assume as well, which is in line with the first assumption, that individuals are acting in accord with their preferences. And it doesn't mean selfish, they are just self-interested. They have a clear preference, people want to learn, what do? They go to a lecture. Or decide not to go to a lecture because they want to study the book. Now, how do we know preferences? We can assume that there are certain preferences. We can ask. In the example of the 3 political parties, there was actually a document in which it was stated how much each party wanted to spend on healthcare and on pensions. So it was rather easy to find out what the preferences were of those political parties. But there are all kinds of ways how to find out what the preferences are. So self-interested individuals acting in accord with their preferences. Seems very simple. I want you to think about the following questions. Is an individual acting rational when this person is religious? Is an individual acting rational when committing suicide? Just discuss in a couple of minutes in 2 people, 3 people, what you think of these questions. Is this rational?
Rationeel. Ben je het rationeel?
Ja, ik vind het best wel rationeel.
Als je suicide
Is het rationeel?
It depends on what you want. But as an individual, you have certain wants and you want to reach them, and religion plays a role in this. Can be perfectly rational in this definition. Everyone agrees?
Yes.
And the second question?
I think it's not rational by committing suicide, because the definition of thinking rational is also observing other alternatives, and by committing suicide you're just weak at one moment of time and you're not seeking any alternative, so it's not rational at that time, but you're not seeking for a different alternative for the long run.
Okay, so here you're not seeking for different alternatives in the long run, so that's why it's not rational. That's one answer. There's also someone else that may want to react.
Yes. Is there someone else?
You're not agreeing, or
Yes. Is there?
Not completely. I understand what he says, but I think when someone commits suicide, he or she doesn't see another better alternative at that moment, but it's an alternative, and it is his best alternative. So that's rational.
yeah, so if you look at, you can either go to a doctor and you get
But on the longer run, there isn't
depressants,
Don't
or
be
you
a fool,
commit
so what about the
suicide.
long
That's
run?
the choice. Then you just no, of course it's not that simple. It's a model, and we model that there's one player and that there are 2 options. Or you go to the doctor, or you just decide, well, no use, and let's quit. And then you can assign the likelihood that one of the 2 helps what you want to achieve. And if if you have the belief that one of the two options, that the likelihood is higher that you're going to achieve your ultimate goal, then I don't see why this cannot be rational. I saw someone else.
There was also with the suicide case, it's a bit gruesome, but if there exists the possibility that you are, for example, in suicide, you're gonna die anyways in a short term, and in any case, dying in both with both chances, one can be extremely painful or and I know it's gruesome, but it's a possibility. So one individual may prefer to die soon and quickly die than use some brain drain a few hours.
Yeah. So we have very specific situations here that can maybe give some insight, whether it's completely rational or not. But we are talking now about options, about ranking of options, and some options are higher ranked than others, and it would be irrational to pick an option which is lowest ranked. Okay?
Yeah, I would say the same, because there are always put a value on such an alternative. So, and values are really not rational. So I think human acting is anyhow not rational.
But you say values, and we just depart from, as rational choice academics, we just depart from values are a given. And if you are acting on the basis of your values, then you are rational, because your goal is acting in line with your values. If you would not act in line with your values, that would be irrational.
Yeah, but your values are not really.
But it doesn't matter.
Because then it's something in your head. You put ranking on it.
We are not interested in where those preferences come from. We just take them at face value, and from that we depart. So if you have certain values because you're female or male and there are differences, that doesn't matter. We just say those values, this person says that he has these and these values, and on that basis he wants certain things. And if he just follows his values, then he's rational. So it's more about the process instead of saying, well, the values are irrational. How is it possible that you are religious, so religion is not rational? No, if you as a person think that religion is important and your whole life is in line with that religion, and that is what you want as a preference, your life being in line with that religion, completely rational.
But in that case, then committing suicide could always be rational, because if that's your value, that shouldn't matter why you came to that decision or if it was a short-term decision, because it's rational all the same.
Yeah, that is, if you have the goal of not wanting to live, of course.
Yes, of course, that's always the goal of committing suicide, right? You're not committing suicide to do something else.
Well, if you are depressed and you wanna solve this depression, you can also make other alternatives.
Yes, but I think in most cases committing suicide, that doesn't have anything to do with values, because the value in this case is not getting out of depression, but not living anymore. And in that case, committing suicide is always rational.
Okay, what you now do is excluding certain elements from your model. You're saying, well, committing suicide is not an option to solve depression. So that is not a solution that we are considering. If we say in our model that that is a solution, and we start thinking about it, then it would fit rationality. If you say, well, solving depression, you should do it differently, or you start using all kinds of drugs, you go to a doctor, you start doing sports, you quit drinking, or all kinds of stuff, and you pick among those, then you're completely right. Then there's no room for committing suicide as a solution to reach your goal. But it all depends what your definition of this goal is.
But the question wasn't, is committing suicide a rational way to solve depression? The question was, could committing suicide be rational? And
Yeah, but I want a discussion, so at least I succeed. That's good. Well, the whole point, and I will just shortly come back to you, the whole point is, strictly speaking, if you follow the values, if you follow what you want to achieve, and you pick your instruments, then everything is rational. That is the message that is behind the rational choice theory. Everything is rational. Set your goals, pick your instruments, use the instruments to reach the goals, and if you are trying to do that, then you are rational as an individual.
But committing suicide, I mean, one does not commit suicide just for fun. It's actually one commits suicide because their life ain't at an optimum peak. So to improve your life, you're ending your life. So that's not very logical.
For you, that's not a goal, but for a lot of other people, that is a goal. So it all depends on what you want to achieve and what you're aiming at. And you just pick your instruments as an individual to reach that goal. That's it.
So simple. One does not simply commit suicide.
Only another point of view. So that for a religious person, being interested is rational. And from an atheist point of view, it's not rational. And then there is a universal rational thing that doesn't exist.
No. What I'm telling is there's a goal, there are tools to achieve that goal, and there is absolutely no judgment whatsoever in rational choice theory if the goal is good or not. So if an individual has a certain goal, chooses an instrument in line with that goal, and tries to achieve that goal, that's completely rational. But there's no judgment whatsoever on whether the goal is good or not.
Hij moet dat je. Ja toch? Tegelt.
No, it would be irrational for the atheist to be religious.
Zo'n Samsung, precies een beetje, dat met touches hè. Precies dat zo'n touch. Dat is wel moeilijk. Mijn groep een stuk dat ze minstens mag opzetten. Maar sommige willen dit toch niet aan.
But we said that preferences are stable. And what you're now saying is that preferences are temporarily not stable. They go all over the place. So then you relax this assumption. And we're not going to do that. We're going to say that we exclude these emotional aspects. And we just say, okay, being emotional can be a situation. And you are just then only analyzing that situation in which that person is very emotional. And this person being emotional has a certain preference. We are analyzing only that. We are not going to extend that period so that you can also analyze the person in different stages. Because then you would violate the first assumption. That's not what we're interested in.
Dat mooi huis gezien. Alleen weet je, het probleem is, geen student, dus jouw vader of mijn vader of Jade's vader moet gewoon garant stellen. En dan kan het wel. Zijn vader heeft checkwork. En de standaard huurcontract. Standaard huurcontract is 6 maanden. Ching ching.
We don't want to give competences to the EU level with regard to budgets. They want to have and decide on their own national budget. And when they decided to have a euro, they were not thinking about we also want to have to lose control of our national budget. But because, at least according to some scholars, because they decided to have a euro, it automatically led, they were pressured into, although they didn't want it, into also losing control over the national budgets. Those discussions are now going on in Brussels. So sometimes there are all kinds of unexpected consequences of, in principle, rational decisions. The decision to have the euro was a rather rational decision, making it easier to trade between member states. But the consequence was highly irrational, losing power over national budgets. So it is possible to make a rational decision, ending up with a situation that you definitely didn't want. So these dynamics are going on, of course. And they are very interesting. So if you would model this, then you would say, rational individuals, they are not going to take any kind of risk that they are going to lose control over the national budget. In the end, the result is that they're probably going to lose that control. So what does that mean? That our model is wrong and that we have to add an assumption. For example, that there's no complete information among all actors. They cannot oversee over a longer time period what the effects are of their choices. And if you didn't model this situation, you wouldn't know that this happens if you have a longer time perspective. So no, not every choice is completely rational. The other question that you had, if you have two goals. Now we will see next week that if you have individuals which have two goals, then it's impossible to arrive at a group decision. And that we have to assume that each individual prefers one goal over all the others. Otherwise, with majority rule, it is impossible to arrive at a decision. So having two goals and not having, as it's called, single-peaked preferences is highly problematic for collective decision making. But that's more for next week when we are going to talk about the assumption of single-peaked preferences. I already said a little bit about beliefs. What do I mean with beliefs? It's basically dealing with insecurity. When you have a certain preference, you want to reach a goal, you of course don't really know if you have, if you can pick a goal, pick a tool that automatically leads to your goal. There's high insecurity. So your guess that with one goal you are more likely to reach your goal than with one tool you are more likely to reach a goal than with another one is your belief. So you have to combine your preference with your estimation of the likelihood that with a certain tool you are going to arrive at realizing that preference. So we have to also take into account this belief. So you might want to overthrow a political regime and you can choose to join a demonstration or join a moderate political party, but there is uncertainty. You do not know for sure which action will achieve the outcome. And each individual will make his own estimation. Some will join the political party, others will join the demonstration. And they have beliefs about the effectiveness of one of the two tools. So beliefs link the actions to actual outcomes based on your preferences. So what is rationality then? It's basically acting in accord with one's preferences and one's beliefs. And that's it. Now, let's look at two other assumptions. The first assumption was preferences are relatively stable. The second assumption is for any possible set of alternatives, either one is preferred to the other or there is indifference between the two. So if you have to decide which fruit you want to eat, you have apples and pears and something else, then at least you have to have some kind of idea if you want to have one over the other or you just indifferent between the two. But you have an opinion. You have to have an opinion. We have individuals which have an opinion and have preferences with regard to a set of alternatives. Now in the book, you will see often that they use signs to indicate why the actor, Y prefers X to Y, which is the second line, and you can also be indifferent between X and Y. In the book, it's also every time explained in the text. If you cannot follow this notation, just read very carefully, you would also get it. But I hope that in the process you are able by using these letters to also understand how the formulas work. And I will come back to that in the following courses. Let's go to the third assumption, which is very important. Because this is called transitivity and seems to be very straightforward. So again, the fruit example, what is here expressed on the slides is if an individual prefers apples to pears and pears to lemons, then this individual is also preferring apples to lemons. Pure logic. So there's a ranking, and fruit that is ranking first, fruit that's ranking second and third stand in a certain relationship to each other. So the fruit ranking first is of course preferred over the second and also over the third. This has to be coherent. And each individual, as we will see next week, can have a perfect rational ranking, which is complete and transitive, as it's called, in line with this third assumption. But when these individuals are then deciding what to do, go to dinner, go to a movie, or go to ballet, they have all different rankings, then all the trouble starts. Because how to decide where to go to? You can vote, you have majority rule, but even then we will see that it can be highly problematic to arrive at a decision. It all has to do with this third assumption, this transitive preference ordering. Now, if an individual preferences satisfy comparability and transitivity, then this individual is said to possess a preference ordering. The rational choice is the alternative at the top of the ordering, so we're maximizing utility. So in summary, rational choice is a positive theory seeking explanations of collective decision making. We discussed these rationality assumptions and we looked at maximizing utility. Now do not forget to submit the assignment.